Hi everybody, this is Eugene O'Loughlin and welcome to my series of short how-to videos. In this video we're going to learn how to plot a correlation matrix in R. So very often when we want to examine correlations between variables and where we have multiple variables in a data set, a correlation matrix is a very useful tool both as a matrix in itself and also to be able to visualize the matrix in a diagram. So we're going to look at two versions of a diagram here. So the data set that I'm going to use is available in the Datarium package. If you haven't already installed this package, go to the Packages tab on RStudio, click on Install, and in the packages type in the word Datarium and RStudio will install the package for you. And I've already done that. So let me load this then into my RStudio with the library function and take a look at the first 6 lines of this data set here. There's 200 records in the data set in total. And what this is marketing data for sales. What sales are based on advertising. So for example, in week 1 here you can see YouTube advertising spend was 276, Facebook 45, and newspapers 83, and we got sales of 26.52, and so on for the rest. And so what we'd like to be able to do is visualize the correlations between these variables. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a simple correlation matrix. So I'm going to call that cormat and assign it using the cor function the correlation of the marketing data set that's inbuilt into R. So when I run that and display the contents of my new vector called cormat, run that, we can get a typical correlation matrix in a tabular format here. Now, while that's very useful in a small data set like this, in larger ones it can be a little bit more awkward. So what I'm going to do is try and visualize that. So the simplest way to visualize a matrix is to use the plot function. So just plot marketing. And R then will figure out that there are 4 variables in the data set and it will plot each of these against each other in a matrix. So when I run this, we get over in the plot section in RStudio, we get a fairly scrunched up diagram here, so I'm going to zoom in on it. And we can see here that we can get a pattern of plots of each variable against each other over this matrix that you see here. So we can see, ignore the diagonal line down the center, we're only really interested in one side, and we can see here that there's practically no correlation between YouTube and Facebook, very little correlation at all, if any, between YouTube and newspaper, and we can see that there's a strong-ish correlation between YouTube and sales. So we can visually inspect this diagram to look at how the correlations compare to each other. Another version of a diagram like this is to use what's called a heat diagram. So use colors to represent the correlations. So let me put that one away and try the next version here. Now to do this, we're going to need 2 libraries. Now the first library is the common and well known ggplot2 library. Again, if you have not got this library already installed, go to the Packages tab, click on Install and type in ggplot2. So I have it already installed, so no need for me to do that here. So let's run this using the library function. And we're also going to need a function called reshape. And it's version 2, reshape 2. Again, if you haven't got that installed, install it as instructed before. I'm going to run this library. And now I've got the 2 packages loaded into my library that I need to perform the next stage. Now before I can use the ggplot function, I need to do what's called melt the data frame. Okay, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to create a new vector called melt, my cormat. Let me just make that O a smaller O there, cormat. Assign it what the results of the melt function. So the melt function, I'm going to use this on my my correlation matrix. So that's what I've created up above on line 10. So that's going to be my cormat. So to recap here, I'm creating a new version of this matrix called which is melted the data. And what this does is reshapes the data into a more computer friendly form. So we'll take a look and see what that means at the moment using a melt of my correlation matrix called cormat. So let me run that. Okay, and now I want to take a look at the melted matrix. So just type out melt Multicormat, run that to see what it looks like. And you can see here that we've got, at this time, 16 records here, but very importantly, we've got 3 columns now compared to what we had before. So we can still see the correlation coefficients here in the value section, but we can see here that we've got all the various correlations against each other, YouTube against YouTube, Facebook against YouTube, newspaper against YouTube, and so on. So we've got them all in a different format here, and now this makes it easier to use the ggplot library. So now I'm going to use ggplot. And if you haven't used ggplot before, do go to the help section and type in ggplot to find out more information about this function. It's a very common and widely used function in R. So the first thing we need to tell it is where the data are from. So data is equal to, in my case here, melt cormat, my correlation matrix. So it's the melted version of the correlation matrix that I want to use here. Then I'm going to put in a comma. And the next thing to do then, and I'm going to move down to the next line to give myself a bit of space here, is to use the AES function. Now, again, the AES function, you can also search for that in the help section and find out some information about this function, which is all about the aesthetics, how graphics look. So we need to tell ggplot how to make this look. Now we can go to pass it over 3 values in here. Okay, so I'm going to pass it the var1 value as an x, var2 value as a y, and value as a fill function, fill parameter. So just put this in here. So x is equal to var, watch the typing, make sure you've got all the upper and lowercase correct here. So var1 is the title of the first column, y is equal to var2, that's the title of the second column, and then fill is equal to the value. Right, so we're going to take all the values, YouTube, Facebook, newspaper, and so on, var1, compare them with the variables in the var2 column, and then fill in the values in color for the correlation matrix. And there's one more thing I need to add in after all of this here is in ggplot we always use the GEOM functions, and the one I want to use here is I'm going to use a tile format. So you can select, you can see here that there's loads and loads of them here, so I'm going to scroll down until I get to the tile format, GEOM tile. No need to pass anything into the function there, just leave the inside the brackets blank there. So when I run this, I get a nice correlation matrix over here on the right hand side. Let's zoom in on it to get a better view of it. And first of all, ignore the diagonal line from the bottom left up to the top right. You can see using the values over here that these are bright blue, which have values, correlation coefficients of a value of 1.00, and that is each variable plotted against itself. So you will always get a value of 1 for that. But you can see here as well that the darker values correspond to our low correlation. So if I just look at the values above the diagonal, because the values below are the reverse of them, you can see that the correlation between YouTube and Facebook is very low, YouTube and newspaper is very low, YouTube and sales is a little bit higher. You can see there's a lighter value there. So where we have dark values, that represents low correlations, and where we have light values, that represents high correlations. So that's how you plot a correlation matrix in R. I hope you found this video useful. Thank you for your attention.